priority for the work of their respective foundations. The moderator for this session will be Charlene Hunter-Gault. Charlene Hunter-Gault is a pioneer, award-winning journalist who's worked in every medium over the last 40 years, print, broadcast, radio, and television for the New Yorker, New York Times, PBS, McNeil-Lehrer, and NPR, and was the CNN bureau chief in Johannesburg, where she frequently reported on HIV and AIDS. She is currently a freelance journalist, and her latest must-read book is New News Out of Africa, covering issues of the African Renaissance. So, without further ado, we will introduce and welcome to the podium Charlene Hunter-Gault, Bill Clinton, and Bill Gates.
Well, that was a welcome to wake you up. Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, and welcome to this session where the two men who've hit the road to learn about HIV and AIDS all over the world will discuss the road ahead. I myself await this conversation with great anticipation and eagerness, having just finished the NPR series on poverty in Africa that put for me into stark, thank you. But that series put for me, who's lived in Africa for 10 years and thought that I had seen everything there was to see. But as I went around the continent, several countries, this put into starker relief for me than ever the impact of HIV and AIDS on poverty. Now more than war, the grim twins challenging Africa's Renaissance. I continue to be astounded each time I go on the road and see up close and personal the toll AIDS is taking, especially on women, as Bill Gates pointed out yesterday. Women are the face of poverty. Women are the face of AIDS in Africa. And as I look at the reports on AIDS around the world, while sub-Saharan Africa has the largest number of people living with HIV and AIDS, the continent is not alone in this near unimaginable misery. So unimaginable that it seems clear to me that it will take the greatest imagination and ingenuity to chart a course for the road ahead. And with us today are two men who have both the imagination and the ingenuity. But before I introduce them, let me take care of a couple of procedural details. If you have questions for either or both of them during this session, please write them on a piece of paper. There's supposed to be ushers, ubiquitous, who will receive those papers and get them to us on the stage, and I will ask the questions on your behalf. We'll get to as many as time allows. Now to two men who need no introduction, therefore their introduction will be brief. Bill Gates, chairman of Microsoft Corporation and co-chair of the $62 billion Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has made AIDS a key focus of the foundation and focuses on a favorite theme of mine. Both he and Melinda do this, and that is, you have to go there to know there. He's been to where the problems are, And he's not hung his head or wrung his hands, as many of you know or may have read about in his opening address to this gathering on Sunday. Moreover, he has pledged to devote most of his time to this and other good causes by 2008, when he will relinquish his hands-on position at Microsoft and apply them to helping the world's people help themselves. Since leaving office as the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton also has been there to know the world over. Through the Clinton Foundation, the President is focusing, as they say, big time on HIV and AIDS, with an initiative that aims to make AIDS treatment more affordable, especially in developing countries, concentrating also on treatment and prevention. The Foundation has programs in more than 1,500 countries. Gentlemen, given all of the first of all, thank you for being here. Given all of the problems in the world today, starting with you, President Clinton, why have you chosen AIDS to spend so much time and energy on it?
Government's gotta pay. Doctors want to stay. Government's gotta pay. Doctors want to stay. Government's gotta pay. Doctors want to stay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have that message. Thank you. Has everybody got that? Everybody's got it. Let's give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you. I think we got that. You got it? We got it. President?
I actually agree with that. We do need a lot more nurses. And our foundation actually is hiring quite a number in Kenya working with the government there. But to go back to what the question you asked, it is difficult to imagine how the world can grow together and overcome the instabilities and inequalities of global interdependence unless something serious is done to turn the tide on aid. One. Two, it's a breathtaking human tragedy. Most people don't die of it in rich countries anymore, and most people who get it in poor countries do. And it's unacceptable. And the third reason I got involved in it is I believe that there were things that I could do because of the life experiences I'd had. Even though I didn't have a lot of money, I had some bilateral donors who were helping me. And now we have, of course, the Global Fund and the PEPFAR program. And Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation, all these wonderful people involved in this. There are a lot of these countries didn't have organized responses. The market for medicine wasn't organized. We got the price of the first-line drugs down now to as low as $120 a person a year. The market for the initial tests wasn't organized. The market for the testing equipment and evaluating whether the medicine was there or not organized. The cost of the pediatric medicine was prohibitive. And nobody had done anything yet about the second-line drugs, which we're negotiating lower prices for. So I thought I could help do all this stuff and help people set up systems that would work and treat more people. While we can talk later about what needs to be done on prevention and all that, and Bill and Melinda and what they've done on microbicides is, I think, unbelievable. But what I wanted to do is just try to stop people from dying that didn't have to die. And and to give these countries a chance to have a future. And I thought we could do something nobody else was doing. And so I did it. It's best I could. And I cared about it when I was president. I cared about it when I left. But it seemed to me that we could never really bring the world together with all these things dividing it unless we could get ahead of this AIDS epidemic. And I still believe that.
I want to pursue some of those points as we continue on in the conversation. But Bill Gates, what led you to AIDS as a priority?
Well, our foundation had a progression where we started out looking at population issues and thinking that if you could help families have the tools that they wanted to have less children, they could do that. That was the key thing, because then you could do better on education and nutrition. And as we learned about that, we found out that the healthier the environment, the more it promotes the idea that you don't have to have a huge number of children to be sure you're going to have support in old age. So we moved into health, and we're stunned to find that things like diarrheal diseases or respiratory diseases really weren't getting the R&D focus. That despite the wonderful advances in biology that were giving us opportunities to do great medicines, that wasn't being exploited for these infectious diseases, which in fact account for the big disparity between developing world and rich world. And so once we got into that, of course, AIDS got onto the agenda. An epidemic like AIDS, the sooner you act, the impact is unbelievable, because for every case you stop today, it stops literally dozens of cases that will take place later. So the sooner you can get in with new tools, the better. And in some ways, AIDS is the most cruel disease of all, because between the time you get sick and the time you die, you're suffering, you're using up economic resources, you're in the prime of your life. In many cases, the chance of you infecting your partner is extremely high, and that has a huge impact on your children. And so we really can't achieve goals of giving these countries a chance to share in the great largesse that rich countries have gotten used to, unless we address this epidemic. And it is one where organizing things, it doesn't happen naturally. The people in need don't have money to cause the normal sort of capitalistic response that you'd expect. And so it takes people like Clinton Foundation to come in and look at the testing costs and drug costs, or perhaps us coming in on some of the research issues around microbicide or vaccine. It takes that kind of actor to come and get involved.
But let me ask you this, because despite the fact that AIDS is stabilizing in some countries, it's even declining in some countries. But in most countries, including countries in the industrialized West, let alone in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have the highest incidence of AIDS, it's on the increase. So given that kind of scenario, our topic today is the road ahead. But is it a rocky road we're looking at, or do you see any smooth spaces in that road?
Well, I think it'll be a rocky road until we have a vaccine or a cure. But if you look at around the world, the Caribbean is the only region where the infection rates are dropping as a region.
And why is that?
I think partly because it's small enough to get a handle on it. In different population centers, and getting medicine, doing education, doing prevention, doing care, the whole 9 yards. I think they've really done a good job of that. Secondly, in the United States, the infection rate is going up among certain discrete populations, I think because we acted like the problem was whipped. And like women of color, for example, are particularly at risk for a lot of reasons that are self-evident to people that are working in that area. But I think that's just a question of our tuning into it again and going after it. By far the biggest problem is in all the developing countries of the world, and 90% of the people who are HIV positive don't know it. Bill made a point yesterday in his presentation here that in spite of the fact that we've gone from like 200,000 to over 1.3 million people getting treatment, getting the ARVs since 2003, since the AIDS conference in Barcelona in mid-2002 and then later. That's
priority for the work of their respective foundations. The moderator for this session will be Charlene Hunter-Gault. Charlene Hunter-Gault is a pioneer, award-winning journalist who's worked in every medium over the last 40 years, print, broadcast, radio, and television for the New Yorker, New York Times, PBS, McNeil-Lehrer, and NPR, and was the CNN bureau chief in Johannesburg, where she frequently reported on HIV and AIDS. She is currently a freelance journalist, and her latest must-read book is New News Out of Africa, covering issues of the African Renaissance. So, without further ado, we will introduce and welcome to the podium Charlene Hunter Gault, Bill Clinton, and Bill Gates.
Well, that was a welcome to wake you up. Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, and welcome to this session where the two men who've hit the road to learn about HIV and AIDS all over the world will discuss the road ahead. I myself await this conversation with great anticipation and eagerness, having just finished the NPR series on poverty in Africa that put for me into stark, thank you. But that series put for me, who's lived in Africa for 10 years and thought that I had seen everything there was to see. But as I went around the continent to several countries, this put into starker relief for me than ever the impact of HIV and AIDS on poverty. Now more than war, the grim twins challenging Africa's Renaissance. I continue to be astounded each time I go on the road and see up close and personal the toll AIDS is taking, especially on women, as Bill Gates pointed out yesterday. Women are the face of poverty. Women are the face of AIDS in Africa. And as I look at the reports on AIDS around the world, while sub-Saharan Africa has the largest number of people living with HIV and AIDS, the continent is not alone in this near unimaginable misery. So unimaginable that it seems clear to me that it will take the greatest imagination and ingenuity to chart a course for the road ahead. And with us today are two men who have both the imagination and the ingenuity. But before I introduce them, let me take care of a couple of procedural details. If you have questions for either or both of them during this session, please write them on a piece of paper. There's supposed to be ushers, ubiquitous, who will receive those papers and get them to us on the stage, and I will ask the questions on your behalf. We'll get to as many as time allows. Now to two men who need no introduction, therefore their introduction will be brief. Bill Gates, chairman of Microsoft Corporation and co-chair of the $62 billion Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has made AIDS a key focus of the foundation and focuses on a favorite theme of mine. Both he and Melinda do this, and that is, you have to go there to know there. He's been to where the problems are, and he's not hung his head or wrung his hands, as many of you know or may have read about in his opening address to this gathering on Sunday. Moreover, he has pledged to devote most of his time to this and other good causes by 2008, when he will relinquish his hands-on position at Microsoft and apply them to helping the world's people help themselves. Since leaving office as the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton also has been there to know there the world over. Through the Clinton Foundation, the President is focusing, as they say, big time on HIV and AIDS, with an initiative that aims to make AIDS treatment more affordable, especially in developing countries, concentrating also on treatment and prevention. The foundation has programs in more than 1,500 countries. Gentlemen, given all of the, first of all, thank you for being here. Given all of the problems in the world today, starting with you, President Clinton, why have you chosen AIDS to spend so much time and energy on?
Government's gotta pay. Doctors wanna stay. Government's gotta pay. Doctors wanna stay. Government's gotta pay. Doctors wanna stay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have that message. Thank you. Has everybody got that? Everybody got it. Let's give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you. I think we got that. You got it? We got it. President?
I actually agree with that. We do need a lot more nurses. And our foundation actually is hiring quite a number in Kenya, working with the government there for that. To go back to what the question you asked, it is difficult to imagine how the world can grow together and overcome the instabilities and inequalities of global interdependence unless something serious is done to turn the tide on aid. One. Two, it's a breathtaking human tragedy. Most people don't die of it in rich countries anymore, and most people who get it in poor countries do. And it's unacceptable. And the third reason I got involved in it is I believe that there were things that I could do because of the life experiences I'd had. Even though I didn't have a lot of money, I had some bilateral donors who were helping me. And now we have, of course, the Global Fund and the PEPFAR program, and Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation, all these wonderful people involved in this. There are a lot of these countries didn't have organized responses. The market for medicine wasn't organized. We got the price of the first-line drugs down now to as low as $120 a person a year. The market for the initial test wasn't organized. The market for the testing equipment and evaluating whether the medicine was there or not organized. The cost of the pediatric medicine was prohibitive. And nobody had done anything yet about the second-line drugs, which we're negotiating lower prices for. So I thought I could help do all this stuff and help people set up systems that would work and treat more people. While we can talk later about what needs to be done on prevention and all that, and Bill and Melinda and what they've done on microbicides is, I think, unbelievable. But what I wanted to do is just try to stop people from dying that didn't have to die. And and to give these countries a chance to have a future. And I thought we could do something nobody else was doing. And so I did it as best I could. And I cared about it when I was president. I cared about it when I left. But it seemed to me that we could never really bring the world together with all these things dividing it unless we could get ahead of this AIDS epidemic. And I still believe that.
I want to pursue some of those points as we continue on in the conversation. But Bill Gates, what led you to AIDS as a priority?
Well, our foundation had a progression where we started out looking at population issues and thinking that if you could help families have the tools that if they wanted to have less children, they could do that that was the key thing. Because then you could do better on education and nutrition. And as we learned about that, we found out that the healthier the environment, the more it promotes the idea that you don't have to have a huge number of children to be sure you're going to have support in old age. So we moved into health. And we're stunned to find that things like diarrheal diseases or respiratory diseases really weren't getting the R&D focus. That despite the wonderful advances in biology that were giving us opportunities to do great medicines, that wasn't being exploited for these infectious diseases, which in fact account for the big disparity between developing world and rich world. And so once we got into that, of course, AIDS got onto the agenda. An epidemic like AIDS, the sooner you act, the impact is unbelievable, because for every case you stop today, it stops literally dozens of cases that will take place later. So the sooner you can get in with new tools, the better. And in some ways, AIDS is the most cruel disease of all, because between the time you get sick and the time you die, you're suffering, you're using up economic resources, you're in the prime of your life. In many cases, the chance of you infecting your partner is extremely high, and that has a huge impact on your children. And so we really can't achieve goals of giving these countries a chance to share in the great largesse that rich countries have gotten used to, unless we address this epidemic. And it is one where organizing things, it doesn't happen naturally. The people in need don't have money to cause the normal sort of capitalistic response that you'd expect. And so it takes people like Clinton Foundation to come in and look at the testing costs and drug costs, or perhaps us coming in on some of the research issues around microbicide or vaccine. It takes that kind of actor to come and get involved.
But let me ask you this, because despite the fact that AIDS is stabilizing in some countries, it's even declining in some countries. But in most countries, including countries in the industrialized West, let alone in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have the highest incidence of AIDS, it's on the increase. So given that kind of scenario, our topic today is the road ahead. But is it a rocky road we're looking at, or do you see any smooth spaces in that road?
Well, I think it'll be a rocky road until we have a vaccine or a cure. But if you look at around the world, the Caribbean is the only region where the infection rates are dropping as a region.
And why is that?
I think partly because it's small enough to get a handle on it. In different population centers, and getting medicine, doing education, doing prevention, doing care, the whole 9 yards. I think they've really done a good job of that. Secondly, in the United States, the infection rate is going up among certain discrete populations, I think because we acted like the problem was whipped. And like women of color, for example, are particularly at risk for a lot of reasons that are self-evident to people that are working in that area. But I think that's just a question of our tuning into it again and going after it. By far the biggest problem is in all the developing countries of the world, and 90% of the people who are HIV positive don't know it. Bill made a point yesterday in his presentation here that in spite of the fact that we've gone from like 200,000 to over 1.3 million people getting treatment, getting the ARVs since 2003, since the AIDS conference in Barcelona in mid-2002 and then later, that area of knowing their status and stop them from being afraid of being tested. If there is an aggressive effort against stigma and an absolute guarantee you'll have the medicine and care you need, then we could have more people know their status, and I think more people would be willing to do whatever's necessary not to infect others. I don't see how we're ever going to catch up unless people are at least aware that they could be giving the virus to other people.
But Bill Gates, you're concerned about women, and as we know, the fastest growing population of AIDS-infected people is women. They have the highest incidence of AIDS in the world. But how do you deal with stigma? Even President Mandela, an icon to everybody in the world who lost a son to AIDS, came out and said, this is like any other disease. Come on, people, let's get our status known. And nobody's getting their status known. How do you overcome this stigma? Do you see any examples around the world where you go?
Well, certainly having a treatment program in place that's broadly accessible does start to change the dialogue, because then you have healthy people out in the community ideally talking about their status and saying, hey, if you get tested, you can get the drugs, and We're seeing a bit of data from Botswana, which was one of the earliest places in Africa that treatment got going, that you start to change the dynamic. There's always been the fear that as you get treatment to be broader, that it could actually work against us, that the fear of getting the disease goes down, and so you see behavioral changes that actually work to spread the disease even more than it already has. AIDS is not a field where we've turned the corner yet, or solved the toughest problems. We have in rich countries, but that's not where the epidemic really is. And in fact, if you look at some countries like India or Nigeria, there's this huge question of how big the epidemic could become there. Probably more people will get infected with AIDS in the future than have in the past. And how could we change that? How could we prevent that from being true? Probably it's impossible without some new tools. Yes, condom use should cause the epidemic to go down, but we haven't succeeded in that except in very few cases, Thailand being really the only one that is clear-cut on that. If we had a tool for a woman to use that we don't today, either the daily pill or the microbicide, I think that would change the course of the disease, and that we would finally start to have years where you'd see total less people infected. And even once you get to that milestone, you still have more people who are going to be infected, and you have all the people that you need to provide lifelong treatment to. So there's nothing simple about this cause. It's not one that people pick because they think you're going to be solving things in any short time frame. It's got to be a lifelong endeavor.
But how far down the line is a female condom, or is the microbicide, or the femidone is already out there? I mean, how long do we have to wait for this?
There's trials going on today. President Clinton and I were in Durban just in July and got to meet Gita Ramji, who's running some trials there in Durban, and just unbelievable, and talk with some of the trial participants. It's always interesting to ask them, what's this, how do you like the microbicide? Melinda was better at asking about some aspects, perhaps. We'd say, well, how many do you use? But that's kind of a personal question. Anyway, so there are trials going on. These are so-called first generation. And there's a good chance the first generation will not provide the impact we want. There's a second generation behind that, but if we have to wait for that, we're talking about 4 to 5 years before we have it. Oral prevention is also not gone as fast as it should. We blame ourselves for not pushing that more. We need more trials. Some trials got started, got shut down because all the understanding about getting people to understand how it was being done wasn't done.
Who's to blame for that? I mean, how do you...
Well, a number of people. We could have done a better job. Our partner could have done outreach to the community better. There were some activists who came in from Europe who spread some facts that weren't correct that just really caused a huge problem there. We've got to put more energy into standing up to those things and making sure that the design is rock solid.
Bill Clinton, do you see enough coordination among AIDS activists and people like yourselves, the two of you and your foundation? Because, I mean, it seems to me there's a lack of will here, or a lack of coordination or something. What is it that isn't pushing this thing or making sure that everybody's on the same page so that you can not have these kinds of problems?
Well, I'd like to make just one point about this prevention thing first. I think that prevention programs are constrained for the same reason that care programs are, by not having networks in rural areas. And it's Dr. Paul Farmer and others have been working with us in Rwanda and elsewhere, work they're doing in Lesotho and other places to bring health care out into rural areas. Brings you both prevention and the antiretroviral care if you do it right. Second thing I want to say about stigma is, what we're trying to do is to find people who are recognized and respected who are HIV positive and let them help us fight stigma. In Lesotho, we have a former boxing coach who was on his deathbed and is in great shape now. We have a woman who's a rape victim, a young woman going out into rural areas telling everybody they should know their status, and she's not ashamed, and she's not going to be a victim for the rest of her life. I think we have to do that everywhere. Now, on the coordination thing, I would just only make 2 points briefly, and Bill can maybe speak to this more than me. One of the most exciting things about having the Gates Foundation fund all this research and then get the gift from Warren Buffett is that it will increase their leverage to demand that anybody that gets the benefit of their investment share their findings and work together and coordinate and not waste money building empires when they could be saving lives. That's great. And I think they've been doing it. One of the things that we try to do when we go into a country, and about almost 60 countries can now buy medicine off our low-cost contracts, but we work in 25 where we try to build these kind of cooperative networks. We only go where the government asks, and then we're only interested in working with whoever else is there. If it's PEPFAR, it's the Global Fund, if it's the development offices of our... I think that's something that has to be done literally country by country and in big urban areas, area by area.
Well,
somebody has to do it.
How important is leadership, governmental leadership, for example?
It's real important, but it can come in different ways. I mean, I'll give you an example. The Chinese were in denial about AIDS. Then they decided they wouldn't be. And they turned on a dime. I mean, we had this big conference at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and these government ministers came and shook hands with an AIDS activist for the first time, and 10 days later the premier had AIDS activist in his office, and 6 weeks later the president of China was visiting people on their deathbeds in hospitals. I mean, they turned on a dime like that. But last year the government called and said, would you please go out into these rural capitals and be on television seen playing with children and having lunch with people, because we still have all this stigma in rural areas. But the point is, I couldn't have done any of that, and there wouldn't have been possible if there weren't leadership. So it's really, really important that leaders are vested in this. But the leaders don't necessarily have to be the reigning head of government if you have a critical mass enough to create a cultural drift, and at least the government doesn't undermine you with counterproductive policies. But a lot of this stuff has to take place in people's heads. And so, for that, you have to have leadership.
Now, Bill Gates, you mentioned earlier condom use, and you also mentioned PEPFAR. And there's a lot of confusion, particularly in the developing world, about the conditionalities, as they see it, on this money. Is PEPFAR and its conditionalities a good thing or a bad thing? And this whole issue of emphasizing abstinence and be faithful over condom use, is that helping or hurting the cause?
Well, PEPFAR is overwhelmingly an incredible program. Incredible in its scale, which is now up at over $3 billion a year, and incredible in its impact. When we were in South Africa at the microbicide trial site, one fantastic thing that had happened there is PEPFAR had funded a treatment center that was literally next door. So anybody who was in the trial who contracted AIDS during the trial would immediately be sent over and put onto the treatment regime. And that really helps drive research forward. The numbers there are pretty phenomenal. PEPFAR is a very measurable thing, and it's had to get going very quickly. People had a lot of doubt. Would they be willing to buy these generic drugs? Well, I sat there and seen cabinets full of drugs from India and South Africa that were brought by PEPFAR at these low costs that Clinton Foundation has been so key in driving forward. So on the treatment front, PEPFAR is a great success, and we need to get that story out there, because there isn't the kind of grassroots support that would necessarily keep the U.S. donating at not only that level, but the increasing level that's needed, unless we get that story out, that lives are being saved, this thing is being run very well. On the prevention front, things are far more complicated, because everything that we've tried, for example, education does not change behavior as much as we'd like. It's a first step, it's important, but it does not. And country by country, prevention has worked better in some. It's worked in Uganda much better than, say, it's worked in South Africa.
But of course in Uganda now there's a real de-emphasis on condom use, and I understand it's having a negative impact on incidence of AIDS.
Now, most of those stories about those changes are overblown. PEPFAR comes in with money to do things. There's money from the local government as well that can take whatever the gaps are and deal with those things. The increase in treatment that Global Fund and PEPFAR have caused, people, it's great to have lots of ideas about how to improve those things, but the basic story of success there and how well that's gone, that should not be covered up, and because we need voters in Europe, voters in Japan, voters in all these different countries to feel good about what they've done, because this is serious amounts of money, and we need maybe 3 or 4 times as much before we get to the real levels.
President Clinton, the conditionalities that say you can't counsel abortion and you can't get money if you do abortions, or that you cannot put condom use on the same level as the other 2 of the ABCs. You said things have to happen in people's heads. Now, is that going to be a negative impact?
First of all, let's disaggregate this a little bit. As I understand the law, and I think I understand it, 30% of the money appropriated by the United States Congress for PEPFAR has to be spent in some form or fashion, on abstinence programs. Now, 70% of what they appropriate is still a whole lot of money, and more than most other countries appropriate. And I think that's really, really important to emphasize. Thank you. So I agree with what Bill Gates said. I think PEPFAR, on balance, has done a terrific amount of good. We work with them in many countries. Same kind of people do that work for PEPFAR that would do that work for anybody else, and by and large, in most countries, and they've done really well. A big breakthrough was when the President agreed to submit the generic drugs to the FDA for approval, and if the FDA approved them, then American taxpayer money could be used to buy them. That was a huge breakthrough, and it has enabled all of us to save a lot more lives. Now, on the abstinence education, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does the research show? It's not conclusive, but it seems to show that if you have an aggressive abstinence education program, it delays young people's initial sexual encounters. But then when they have it, they're less likely to be protected and therefore more likely to be infected. So it's like everything else in this crazy field we're working in. There's a little good news and a little bad news. And what I think that what it argues for is that it's a good thing with young people particularly to have education and to promote abstinence, but an abstinence-only program is going to fail. And in the end, you're going to wind up being in a cruel fix. On the other hand, I think if you want to get the benefit of the American money, and also if you want to get the benefit of the research and common sense, it's a mistake to walk away from that message altogether, because it can help young people stay alive and have a longer period of time when they're not infected. It's just that you can't do abstinence only. So we need a little bit of humility here, but I also believe it's a mistake not to acknowledge that on balance this program's done way more good than harm, and I'm personally very grateful for it.
I want to get to audience questions in a moment because I've looked at them and they're fabulous. I want to ask you one more question quickly, both of you, and maybe you could answer briefly. Have you seen anything out there that has surprised you, either in a good way or a bad way? Bill Gates?
Well, as President Clinton said, this is a field where every day you find good things that are going on that make you optimistic, and then you'll see where things have turned around and gone the wrong way. The fact that we haven't been able to conquer mother to child, that we still have, because of stigma, because of lack of getting things out there, we still have mother to child transmission. That's disappointing. We should be doing better on that. The fact that these drug trials, microbicide or oral prevention, haven't moved further, that's very disappointing. But then again, when you go out and actually meet with the patients that are on treatment and hear about how they're still teaching and raising their kids and spreading the message and things like that, it makes one very optimistic. And some countries have turned around the epidemic. There's a variety of factors that that tend to go into that. Just this male circumcision thing, it's very likely, a couple more trials have to complete, it's very likely that will be a helpful tool. Not a magic bullet, but a thing that will drop the numbers down in a pretty big way. India is a place where we got involved early in creating community in order to help influence behavior. It wasn't enough to just get the message out about condom use. You literally had to create community centers that people could go into and talk with each other, meet with other people who had similar experience. And only when you created that foundation, which meant starting from scratch to build a whole place to get together, then you had the context to talk about behavior change. And that, looks like it's having a real impact.
I want to have Bill Clinton answer that question about surprise in a minute, but I just want to pursue one thing with you. Do you find a difference in culture? Of course, all countries have different cultures, but do you find that something might work in one country that doesn't work in another because of culture? Do you have to have a multifaceted approach because countries differ in their cultural practices, their cultural attitudes?
Not really. I haven't come to a country where injecting drug use is easily discussed, or men having sex with men, or commercial sex workers. I hope to go to that country someday where none of those things are controversial or hard to discuss. That we don't really have that. So no country can really give themselves an A in terms of how they pursued things. Even Thailand, that's probably at the top of the list, has had some recurrence type issues and things that they need to stay engaged in. So these problems are pretty universal.
So in other words, back to that other question, if you have a greater coordination among the AIDS groups and the governments and everybody involved in this thing, you can have a general set of principles that would apply across the board. That seems to be what you're saying.
That's right. The solutions that work most of the tools are going to work on a global basis. If we can come up with breakthroughs, most of them will be helpful everywhere, even though it's got to be people in the community that get the word out.
Bill Clinton, surprises?
Well, first, let me answer the second one. I agree with that.
I love being on a panel with you.
I agree with that, but I completely agree that most of what works will work anywhere. But we do know that there's a different sort of psychology in the culture once you get beyond denial. I agree with Bill. We got denial most everywhere, and we know that the systems that work will work most anywhere. But it's surprising, for example, if you look at that New York Times story, a magazine story on the Love Life program in South Africa. It's interesting how messages even that work in one African country on the prevention side don't necessarily work in another. So we do have to be somewhat sensitive to that. Second thing I wanted to say is, I don't know that I was surprised by this, but I think you can never repeat it enough. There was yet another study last week which showed that in the poorest African villages, people take their medicine at a stunningly high percentage accurate. And the first time we saw this was in Brazil, where people didn't speak Portuguese, and all these little Indian villages up in the Amazon Valley, they're all taking it. And so one more time we have driven a nail in the coffin of those that want to patronize the poor. They'll live if you'll give them the tools to live. They'll do just fine.
In the few minutes that we have left, I'm going to try and ask some of the questions from the audience. And here we have one from Ethiopia addressed to Bill.
Must be you.
Okay. Can we address AIDS without addressing poverty in Africa, forgiving debt? Bill?
Well, poverty, in the long run, what you want is all the things that we take for granted in developed countries to be available globally. And that will deal with many of these problems. We can't wait until we have the solution to poverty to go in and take care of these health issues. In fact, by solving these health issues, we do change things and let that positive cycle get going. But in the long run, we should be measured more broadly, not just by the health measures. Certainly debt relief has been a great thing. We're involved in that, agricultural productivity. So the foundation looks at it in that holistic way, even though you've got to have tactics that are disease specific.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, I just think that if you develop the health infrastructure throughout a whole country, particularly in Africa, to deal with AIDS, you will increase the infrastructure dealing with maternal and child health, malaria, TB. Then I think you have to look at nutrition, water and sanitation. All these things, when you build it up, you'll be helping to promote economic development and to alleviate poverty. And I think you've got to have healthy people to grow an economy. So I'm with Bill on this.
This one is for Bill Clinton specifically, and it's asked by Victor Sierra from Ecuador. You did not do much for HIV/AIDS during your presidency. Were the interests of powerful groups too strong? What are the lessons learned from that time for moving ahead with the AIDS fight?
First of all, that ain't so. The death rate, America had perhaps certainly one of the biggest AIDS problems in the world when I was president. The death rate went down 70%. We turned it around, spent a massive amount of money. We did the groundwork on creating the Global Fund. We established the Millennium Vaccine Initiative, and we contributed 25% of all the funds contributed to international AIDS work when I was president. I didn't do much if you compare what is being spent now to what was spent then. That's called living backwards. We live forward. The person who controlled the foreign policy persons of the United States Senate wouldn't pay our UN dues. How can you say I didn't do enough when I tripled overseas investment in aid to HIV and AIDS? I think I did do a good job given what was possible. And so we can look backwards, but we all have to live forward. And I think it's a great thing. Also, the Christian evangelical community, which is the base of the Republican Party, changed from anti to pro. They supported the Millennium Debt Relief Initiative, a lot of which went to AIDS care in my last year as president, and then they supported this new PEPFAR program and President Bush's initiative, and I think it's wonderful. But I think that we should all just keep working together and do more and put one foot in front of the other and talk about what we're going to do tomorrow.
Okay. Bill Gates.
I did make a lot of mistakes when I was president, but that wasn't one of them.
Thank you. This one is specifically for Bill Gates from Dr. Michael Sinclair from the United States of America. We all know his name. In your enthusiasm for new prevention technologies, you not seem to give much priority to public media education and the behavior modification associated with HIV risk reduction. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the foundation is the biggest funder of media-based activities. Kaiser Foundation is a grantee that's done fantastic work reaching out to various media groups. I was actually at the UN when we did a global media launch. We had all the big media companies come in, politicians come in, and talk about how, well beyond just sort of public service advertising, that if you can get the storylines in the soap operas or whatever shows there are, radio and TV, if you can get the news people to understand the issues and report on them and really get people to see the scale of the epidemic in the country, you can make a very big difference. And so part of the advocacy is that kind of media influence. It is a tool that's very, very important. I think in India, for example, we've got to have more reporting about the disease in order for things to change there. So a very important element, and one that indirectly we put a lot into.
And of course, you mentioned Kaiser. Dr. Michael Sinclair is with Kaiser. This next question is one I have seen up close and personal. Bill Clinton, because the question is for either Bill. In Lesotho and in Malawi and in Zambia, everywhere I went on my poverty series looking at AIDS, the doctors complain that they cannot keep nurses and doctors for that matter, but especially nurses, and we've got this crowd over here. No, you just be quiet. We're recognizing you, but this is your issue. They can't keep them. We got the point, we got the message, and this is your question. How do you keep, and this is well phrased, how do we ensure that many more health workers are hired, paid, and trained sufficiently and given the proper tools to do their job so that they can stay in their countries where patients need them? They're immigrating to America, to England, everywhere, and, leaving almost no healthcare workers to take care of this AIDS thing, which is buckling the hospitals and healthcare facilities.
First of all, I think this really is one thing, I think, where there are country-by-country differences. For example, in India, where we both work, there's still a huge number of doctors in little rural areas because it has a unique place in India's culture, but they don't necessarily know very much about HIV and AIDS, so we're trying to train over a period of time 150,000 of them. In other places, you have to get some doctors in. In Kenya, we've got a big nursing shortage, and the government has certain budgetary constraints, so we're hiring nurses and training them. In Rwanda, Dr. Farmers Group Partners in Health is training paramedical personnel, community leaders, because we know as a practical matter there are places where we need a health presence and we're not going to have a doctor or a nurse. And so I think it's imperative, to answer your question properly, that every country has a plan, that it's based on both the real needs and the realistic possibilities, and then that some combination of funding be allocated to carry out that. But we find ourselves doing more and more of this because you can't just take these ARVs and go out in the country and drop them on a parachute into a clearing. You have to have a health infrastructure. And when you build a health infrastructure for HIV and AIDS, you also, I will say again, you improve what can be done for TB, for malaria, for maternal and child health, the whole range of other healthcare needs. So I think it's important, but it really will vary from country to country and region by region within countries.
Okay, we got it. That was a very good answer, and that's your issue. Let's hear from Bill Gates on the question of your issue.
Yeah, I think it's great that there's a recognition that the world's capacity to treat people is not as much gated by the drug price now as it is by the personnel issues. I mean, yes, Clinton Foundation's helped get the cost down to $130 per person per year. It would help a lot if we can get that down to 80 or even 50, which would be heroic, but it probably can be done. We have to work on second line therapies as well. But the big thing is the personnel issues. How much of a doctor's time or a nurse's time? And there's some special roles in terms of dispensing medicines, taking blood tests, things like that, where you may not need a full-blown nurse to do some of these things. The actual operational approaches are probably different in the urban areas than in the rural areas. These community outreach workers who know not just AIDS but other diseases like TB are very important in terms of how it can be done effectively in the rural area. And we're working with Clinton Foundation on taking best practices and trying to say, is the long-term cost $500 when you combine everything together? Could it be $300? Could it be $100? And that really is a very big question. The training capacity has got to be increased in these different countries for both the broad roles and the specialized roles so that doesn't become the bottleneck. And so money is going to have to go into that.
What kind of time frame, I mean, it's like on the microbicide question. I mean, what kind of time frame are we talking about? How urgently are people looking at these questions? And how soon can you see more personnel being made to stay in place?
Well, a lot of the Global Fund and PEPFAR money is going into those training issues of creating the capacity. They've run into that as a bottleneck. When we went into Botswana as long ago as 99, the first 2 years I was very impatient. Our treatment effort there, called ASHAP, was slow to start up, and it was all personnel related making sure they understood how to deal with the special issues that come up in AIDS. So as these treatment programs roll out and smart people are involved in those things, they see that putting the money into those training activities and thinking of it holistically, not just AIDS by itself, is the way to create the best sustainability.
In the short term, Bill Clinton, is there a space for people outside of those countries who are experts, who have the training, etc., to go in while the homegrown indigenous people are being trained?
Absolutely, but I think it works better if they go in with the local people pursuant to a national and regional plans. That's what we always try to do. That is, if the government has to ask us in, then we say, okay, now let's come up with an AIDS plan. Then the government adopts the AIDS plan. Then everybody's out there working together. And I completely agree with what Bill said. I think these system issues are the most important issues in healthcare and parenthetically in development. You know, you look around this room, there's no shortage of intelligence and effort in the developing countries of the world, but there is a crying shortage of not only resources but systems that reward effort. So I think this is to me the number one thing that has to be done.
This is a question from what appears to be a wonderful young citizen. 15-year-old Shamwa Muhammad Jr., who is 15 and the founder of letsstopaids.org. Let's hear it for him. How about that? And I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Shamw. As a youth today, he's from Canada, I have learned that HIV and AIDS plays a key role in my lifestyle. I would like to know what would be your message to young activists like myself for commencing the inspiration and leadership to other children in the world. Bill Gates?
Okay. Well, I think it's a very tough problem when you're, like when you go to the townships in South Africa or some of these countries, to get AIDS to be the top issue that young people think about. They're dealing with so much in terms of their education, will they have a job, the social environment that they live in. So the idea that it's just simply, gosh, if they would just hear this one thing, that would change their behavior. Unfortunately, that doesn't really get there. In rich countries, I will say that providing the dollar resources for things like Global Fund is probably the biggest contribution that rich countries need to do. And so making sure there's a broad base of support for that, and we're not dependent on just a few politicians, thinking, hey, this is a good thing, but rather they know they've got the backing to take those dollars and spend them that way versus the other budgetary priorities. That, I would say, is number one. So if you're in a developed country, you can make sure there is that broad understanding. In terms of changing African youth, if there's a chance where they're visiting, or if you're really willing to go spend large amounts of your time in those countries, there's lots of volunteer programs that let people get out and do that.
Bill Clinton?
Well, first I would say to that young leader that to his fellow Canadians and other young people that he might reach over the net in the developed world, he should tell them that they should care about this, they should lobby their governments to spend more money in it, they should consider volunteering, because it's hard to imagine that the world that he will grow up into and that he will bring children into will be the world he wants unless we do something about AIDS. I would say that in terms of reaching people in other countries, he just needs to remember that kids everywhere are really smart and they're full of dreams until they're crushed out. And if he could build a sense of solidarity across continental, racial, religious, and other lines and income lines, so that young people could work together and be together and get to know one another and advocate for adequate funding and also systems that work, I think it would make a big difference. I think if the young people of the world spoke across the income divide that is yawning greater and greater as the days go by and said we have the same dreams, therefore we deserve the same chances, that would be something really worth doing.
I don't know why this question is included, and I really don't want you to answer it, but I'm going to ask it because it's cute. Would you consider being Prime Minister of Canada, Bill Clinton? But that's okay, you don't have to go there.
I've come to Canada, I think, almost 25 or 30 times since I've been out of office. So probably what I should consider doing is checking with my accountant to see if I owe income taxes in Canada. I don't think I can be a politician here, but I probably should do more to support the government since they've been so nice to me over here over the last 5 years.
Okay, we have just 3 or 4 more questions, and they're really good, so I want to get to them. This one is for both Bills, from Imad Osman Stadi from Sudan. How can treatment be successful when people are malnourished and don't have enough to eat? Why is nutritional/food support not financed? Okay.
Certainly, there's a need to improve agricultural productivity, and the so-called Green Revolution caused in large parts of Asia, including India and China, the nutrition per person to go up very substantially. That was a big breakthrough in terms of wheat, rice, and corn production productivity. Africa didn't get that benefit because of the variety of crops they have and the different weather environments there. And so we, together with Rockefeller Foundation, have a big new initiative to take the ideas of Green Revolution, that is better crops, advice to farmers about how to use those things, get those out there, that we're initiating, because you want the food to be grown in country, you want that farm sector to do very well. We're actually talking with Clinton Foundation about some of the costly inputs like fertilizer, and could they take some of the same approaches they used on AIDS medicine and go after some of these farming inputs and help get as the volume goes up, make sure that the full benefit of that goes into great price reductions and broad distribution. So agricultural productivity is very important. That will drive these nutrition levels up. And these different regimes of asking people to take their medicines will do better as you get rid of those problems. Even so, as the President said, it is amazing how good the compliance has been despite people dealing with those problems.
President Clinton, you must be aware that in Africa, South Africa, the Minister of Health has been particularly keen on nutrition, encouraging olive oil and African potato and things like that to boost the immune system.
Well,
and it's
here's the
become
deal.
a run of a joke. I mean, is this serious? I mean, do you think that's serious?
I think nutrition has gotten a bum rap because some people had offered it as a substitute for antiretrovirals in care. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. It is important. If you can get a decent diet and have a basically healthier lifestyle and environment, then the medicine is likely to work far better. And I think that's why, to go back to what Bill said, we're working in a couple of countries to try to increase agricultural productivity and increase the caloric intake of people in the country, and I think it will increase the overall health as well as the income of the farmers. Now, having said that, there's a lot more than we can discuss here about that. We got to be very careful that we don't further deplete the topsoils, erode the water supply, and undermine Africa's sustainable development, which I think is. But I think that if we can do this in the right way, improving nutrition will increase our capacity to deal with HIV and AIDS, as long as it's not a smokescreen of denial, but another part of what it takes to give people a healthy life. It's a very, very important thing to do.
Bill Gates, I apologize to the person who asked this question because I can't read the middle name, but it looks like Mary Howard Knight from the International Organization for Migration What can the major donors and leaders do to bring attention to population groups left out of national efforts for both prevention and care, such as migrants, refugees, and other mobile populations?
Well, whenever you get displacement, whether it's from war or whatever it is, the health issues that come up are very dramatic. That's where you'll see epidemics of things that, like cholera, that really in normal conditions don't exist. And so being able to jump in those conditions and having the capacity is very important. A lot of the generosity generally comes after the disaster, but the best thing is to have the generosity before the disaster, so people are in place, resources, expertise, and they can come in right away in the first week, say, after there's been a problem. And hopefully we'll have less of these conflict events that create migration in large numbers, but we're still dealing with that, whether it's natural disaster that you've been involved in or war-type situations. We have great partnerships with a number of the NGOs that specialize in getting into those environments and making sure that health care and the health issues are something they've got the expertise and resources for.
Bill Clinton, unless you have something to add to that, let me ask you this other question. And it comes from S. Carter of the USA. We've heard a lot already regarding HIV and women in Africa. Can you also address what needs to be done for African American women and poor women in other developed countries? Separate out those two. Because in the African American population, the thing is rising as fast as it is in Africa, it seems.
Let me just say, with regard to African American women, I sort of alluded to that earlier. We know that the infection rates are going back up. We know that a lot of it is a result of African American women being, ironically, in positions similar to that women in some developing countries find themselves in terms of being infected by partners who themselves are HIV positive, who may have gotten it from IV drug use from other women, from being in prison, from all kinds of things, and that the absence of, that they really are facing the same sort of empowerment issues that a lot of women in developing countries are. And I think we have to go back and try to change that, as well as make a renewed effort on all the fronts we did back in the 1980s in America. With the discrete populations, we've got to go back at all the things we did before that worked and try again. In other countries in the world outside of Africa, I think what Bill and Melinda Gates said yesterday is really true. The more you empower women, the more likely you are to have prevention programs that work, education programs that work, and turn your infection rate back around. To the extent that women are disempowered, devalued, objectified, and worked over, you're going to have higher AIDS infection rates. And I think it's true outside of Asia as well as within. Now, there are we're having a very interesting time now in Papua New Guinea, which has half of all the languages still extant on Earth, and an infection rate of 2%, perhaps the highest in Asia, because there you have traditional tribal cultural societies in a rainforest environment that may be very different. But in most places, wherever women are devalued and not empowered, you're going to have more AIDS problems.
I see the president and the convener of this conference about to hit the stage, so it means that our time is almost up. But I want a concluding statement. I've spent the better part of this summer talking about what I call the 4 Ds of the African apocalypse: death, disease, disaster, and despair, and how that influences, it's the prism through which most people, especially in America, see Africa. And when you talk about AIDS, that seems to fall right into that formulation. So if we talk about AIDS, is there any way that you can leave, any words that you can leave this audience with that says it's important to be involved in this, that there is an end point, that it isn't all just gloom and doom? How do you motivate the public when all they hear about is the downside of despair in Africa and these developing countries, or anywhere where AIDS is prevalent and rising? What's the hope here? And how do you mobilize people to be involved?
First of all, I would say if anybody had ever been to Africa with us, or India, or Southeast Asia, they wouldn't feel that way. And I was just in Liberia, which was totally wrecked by 14 years of the most abusive circumstances you can imagine. And the lights don't come on in the buildings in most places in the capital at night. But after we signed our AIDS agreement, I did a little town hall meeting with the President, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and 100 of their college students. They were just as bright and informed and inquisitive and insistent as any group anywhere in the world. Look, I will say again, the source of optimism is the human materials. There is no shortage of intelligence, effort, dreams, desires in any country in the world. None. There is a shortage of investment, opportunity, and systems that work. Look at here, we get thousands of people in this room because the sound system and the lights and the air conditioning work. These systems would be totally alien to half the people in the world. That's what you have to keep in mind. If people can be rewarded for their efforts with systems that work, with investments, with opportunity, they'll do fine everywhere. And that should be a source of hope for people everywhere.
Assuming you agree with that, Bill Gates, how do you get that message out? How do you inspire people to be engaged in this fight that has so engaged the two of you and Melinda?
Well, I think get-togethers like this one are critical, where you get the people who care the most and let them share what's going right, what's not going well, and let them, after they leave this meeting, go and get the word out. Go and get the word out to voters, to people going through medical school that should want to get involved more in these world health issues. Go to governments in the developing world and talk about how other governments have been doing things right. This meeting is a symptom of how people have decided that the worst medical disaster ever in history, we're going to change those things. And we're not yet at the midpoint of the thing, but I get very optimistic. You know, the side meetings with the scientists, the side meetings with the advocates here, there's a lot of energy here. And time is on our side. Science will give us these new tools. Not as fast as we'd like, and we need to keep giving ourselves a hard time about that. But overall, this is a story that will have a happy ending because of the energy of the people at this event.
And let me just say one other thing. And Bill Gates made a fair amount of money by being able to imagine the future and helping to create a big part of it that we all accessed. Do you really believe that he and his wife would be giving all their money away, and that naive Warren Buffett would give all his money to them to give away, if they didn't believe not only that people's lives were worth saving, but that they could be saved? That's the best evidence I know. He's got pretty good judgment here. He's not known for making bad investments. And I think that it's silly for people to be cynical when they ought to be hopeful.
Thank you, Bill and Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.